Star Trek Voyager Across the Unknown got a lot of criticism and sometimes some praise at its release for how difficult it is. This difficulty actually did catch me off guard when I played, because I played the demo back in November or December of last year, and I thought the demo was really easy. Boy, did that demo not do justice to the challenge level of the actual game. I struggled a lot and had to restart the game multiple times and also save scum individual sectors over and over again in order to learn how to best approach the game's challenges. Without giving away any specific spoilers, I particularly struggled to get through sectors 4 and 5 without running out of deuterium. These sectors are, in my opinion, the peak of the game's difficulty. If you can get through sectors 4 and 5, I think the rest of the game should be mostly downhill. That is not to say that the remaining game is easy. It will still require careful and methodical play. But if you get past sectors 4 and 5 in relatively good condition, then you should have developed the infrastructure and techniques to give yourself enough buffer for suboptimal play that the rest of the game will feel a lot less stressful. With that in mind, I want to coalesce my experience with the game and offer some tips to help new players get through sectors 1 through 5 without having to necessarily go through all of the trial and error that I had to go through. These tips will be specifically focused on the early game, and I'm going to try to avoid any specific spoilers, as this video is intended for people who are stuck in the early sectors of the game, or people who maybe have not played the game yet, but are considering doing so and are just looking at videos and reviews and stuff like that about it. However, there may be some mild to moderate visual spoilers in the footage that I'm going to show in the background, so consider yourself warned. If you would like a proper review, I do have a written review on my personal blog at www.megabearsfan.net, so please check that out. A link will be in the description. And I do have a Patreon account in case you would like to support the content of creation like this in the future. I offer a sincere thank you to all of my patrons, past, present, and future, as you really do help make a difference and make this all feel worthwhile. Also, keep in mind that this video is being produced within the first few months of the game's launch, and the tips are based on the state of the game at that time. Across the Unknown has already received a few fairly significant patches, including one that toned down the difficulty quite a bit. The game is still a living game and may change in the future, so these tips may not necessarily reflect the state of the game in that future if it has received significant updates between the time I recorded and the time you're watching, so take it all with a little bit of grain of salt, especially if you're watching this years down the road. In my humble opinion, deuterium is the most difficult resource to manage in Star Trek Voyager Across the Unknown. It's probably the most critical resource in the game, as it provides all of the fuel for Voyager's trek across the Delta Quadrant. It is constantly being consumed, and the more energy you are pulling from the warp core, the more deuterium you are going to be burning. As such, managing the amount of energy Voyager is expending is critical to early game strategy. To help keep your energy consumption down and to prevent yourself from having to run the warp core at maximum power all the time, you should make a habit of disabling rooms, or in some cases entire decks, that you are not actively using. One of the easiest ways to conserve a small amount of power is to turn off stellar cartography. This room's energy can essentially be cheesed to the point that it's basically entirely free to use. At present, it does not cost any energy to actually use stellar cartography to scan systems and planets and so forth, and you can scan points of interest from anywhere within a system. So what you can do is to simply leave stellar cartography turned off while you travel. Then after you enter a new system, flip it back on, scan all the points of interest without moving, and then turn it back off again. This will reveal all the information about the system without costing you a single point of energy. Other rooms, such as the shuttle bay, aero shuttle, workshop, and maybe even the transporter, can be similarly micromanaged. Now, I do want to warn you that it is possible to run into events that use stellar cartography, or the shuttle bay, or the transporter for some system test. The shuttle bay and transporter are actually fairly common, but I found stellar cartography checks to be very rare. Even so, if you're worried about needing stellar cartography or any of the other rooms to pass a test, you can simply toggle these rooms back on just before dropping out of warp at the point of interest. Early in the game, you may be tempted to start building crew quarters and officer quarters to house your crew and improve morale. Don't do it. Instead, I recommend housing your crew entirely in emergency quarters and leveling those quarters up to level 2 as quickly as possible. The early sectors are probably going to be the hardest in the game. You have fewer resources, less cargo space for storing a buffer of excess resources, and you have less power. Crew and officer quarters take up more space than the emergency quarter, cost more materials to build, and consume more power to run, and on top of all that, they offer less capacity. In my opinion, the morale boost offered by proper quarters does not make up for these other drawbacks early in the game. There are plenty of other opportunities to improve morale, such as providing better food, selecting certain options in away missions, making certain choices, and completing certain side objectives. Bottlenecks in physical resources are a lot harder to overcome in the early game, and won't be as much of a bottleneck if you focus on cheaper, more space-efficient emergency quarters. Later in the game, when your morale is stabilized and you have some resources to spare, then you can start tearing down the emergency quarters to replace them with crew quarters and officer quarters for a morale buff. Just remember to plan out enough space for those larger rooms. One of the best pieces of advice that I can give for the early sectors of Across the Unknown is to build a second and maybe even a third copy of certain key infrastructure. Multiple cargo bays will for sure be an absolute necessity, since each cargo bay can only hold a single type of resource. Other rooms, such as the science lab, sickbay, engineering office, and phaser control room, should also get a secondary room as well, and you should build them sooner rather than later. This will increase the capacity or output of those rooms, while also providing redundancy in case of damage or loss of power. Speaking of which, it may initially seem optimal to try to cram all of your important rooms onto a single deck so that you don't have to spend power on more decks than you need, but this can actually be a trap. First of all, if you lose power to that deck, usually due to sustaining damage to the life support controls during combat, then you'll lose all of your critical infrastructure. For example, if you build multiple science labs, but they're all on the same deck, then losing power to that deck will mean you lose all of your science production and ability to research new technologies. This is true regardless of whether the deck loses power due to damage from combat, or if you simply had to turn the deck off to conserve power. Having these labs spread across multiple decks means that if you lose power to one deck, you'll still have at least some science output. Worse yet, if the same deck, say, Deck 5, happens to house your only copy of the sick bay, hydroponics bay, science lab, biology lab, cargo bay, phaser control room, and maybe even an observation deck, and then that deck loses power, then basically all of Voyager's output and infrastructure will be gone, and you will be in very big trouble. Having these rooms spread out across multiple decks, or having redundancy across multiple decks, makes it much less likely that a single disabled deck can lead to a catastrophic loss of functionality, let alone a game over. It's okay to have all this infrastructure on one deck, just in case you do need to cut power and only have enough power for a single deck, but if you do that, then make sure you are following the previous tip and building redundant copies of rooms on other decks. Secondly, later in the game, you can gain access to more powerful versions of some rooms that stagger multiple decks. Spreading your rooms out across multiple decks will make building these larger multi-deck rooms easier. For one thing, if you have cargo bays or hydroponic bays stacked on top of each other, it's easier to dismantle the old single-deck rooms and replace them with the double-decker upgrade without having to tear apart half the ship to make room. You will probably have to tear apart adjacent rooms as well, because those larger rooms are also wider than the level 1 rooms, in addition to being taller. But as long as you put like batteries or emergency quarters or whatever next to them, you should be okay. Stacking rooms on multiple decks also makes it much easier to slot new multi-deck rooms, such as waste processing, into your layout without having to dismantle any existing rooms. As such, early in the game, I highly recommend just going through all the room options in the construction wheel and look at the size and shape of all rooms that will ever be available. This way, you can start planning for how you want to organize those rooms, and you won't fall victim to a gotcha when you research a new room only to find that you didn't leave enough space to actually build it anywhere. In my first attempt at the game, whenever I would send out an away mission, I would focus on trying to get the most likely outcome. I didn't even notice initially that each choice offered different resource rewards. As such, I frequently chose the path of least resistance, which usually offered few, if any, resource rewards. And when I was getting resources in away missions, they were often resources that I already possessed, and so I wouldn't have enough cargo space to actually keep them. I would walk out of many away missions with hardly anything to show for it other than the story progress. don't make the same mistake I made. Make sure you are looking at the rewards offered by a particular choice, and also the risk assessment, and use that information to decide which options to take. If two options have a similar chance of success, but one of those options offers a resource that you are starving for, then you have an opportunity to give yourself a buffer on that scarce resource. If there isn't a particular resource that you need, or if you're already near capacity on all your hard resources, then I would recommend focusing more on taking the options that provide science points. There is no cap, at least not that I'm aware of, to how many science points you can have stored, so you'll never waste science points the way that you might waste deuterium by collecting deuterium while your deuterium storage is already at or near capacity. When traveling between systems, don't simply hold the button on the system in the sector map to travel to that system in general. This will often warp you to an arbitrary point at the edge of the system and force you to have to spend additional cycles moving at impulse to wherever you actually want to go within the system. Instead, from the sector screen, you should drill down to the system screen and to which specific point of interest you want to warp to in that other system. Warping directly to an objective location or to a resource-rich cluster of planets can spare you from crucial cycles of unnecessary impulse travel. It might be tempting, and might even seem optimal, to systematically gather every resource in a system before moving on to the next one, but this is another trap that the game sets for you. Most sectors will require you to backtrack to systems you've already passed through. If you already cleared the system of all its resources, particularly deuterium and food, then you may find yourself running low, with no way to replenish your supplies. I recommend leaving some resource clusters within each system, especially deuterium and food. You can't stop mid-warp, so you have to plan your pit stops before committing to a warp movement. Trying to warp through 2 or 3 systems can easily take 20 or more cycles, which is plenty of time to burn through your deuterium and or food reserves, and to leave you stuck in gray mode when you drop out of warp at your destination. I recommend that if you have to warp through multiple systems, that you make a habit of stopping at a cluster of resources within each system you pass through, in order to collect some deuterium and or food to replenish your supplies before moving on to the next system. You can then warp directly to the desired location in the next system without necessarily having to spend a single full cycle stopped in the intervening system. Combat in Across the Unknown can be very dull and a passive experience if you let it be. You can literally just take your hand off the controller or keyboard and let Voyager do its thing without any input from you, though I definitely do not advise doing that. By taking a more proactive approach, the system will not only be more engaging, but you will also get more optimal results. For example, in battles against multiple opponents, I recommend targeting the weapon systems of the weakest opponents first. Don't keep firing until a particular opponent is destroyed, surrendered, or retreats. Simply take out the weapons, and then switch to the next weakest opponent. This may drag out the overall length of individual encounters, but it can spare you resources in the long term. Disabling an opponent's weapons means that there's one fewer ship that is shooting back at you. This means fewer and less frequent attacks over the course of the battle. This gives your shields more time to recharge between opponent attacks, which means fewer attacks will go through the shields and damage the hull, disable a room, or injure crew. Once all the opponent's weapons are offline, you will then be free to go back and target engines or the warp core to finish them off and formally end the fight. This final tip is a little bit more geared toward players who might be restarting a campaign after either dying or giving up, though first-time players can still utilize this technique as well. Basically, you do not have to wait until the game tutorializes a particular mechanic before you start exploiting that mechanic. Small sequence breaks in the first sector are possible, and can give you a head start and ease some of the pressure that the next few sectors may put on you. The most notable such sequence breaks are that you can repair the science lab and start researching technologies before the game instructs and tutorializes you on how to do so. And you can start assigning heroes to rooms before the game tells you to do that. Assigning heroes early will probably only provide marginal benefits, if any. However, assigning someone to the science lab can boost your early research rate. This, combined with conducting research before you are tutorialized to do so, can be a big boon to the early game. You can unlock infrastructure such as hydroponics bays, the biology lab, or even level 2 upgrades to some rooms quite a bit earlier than you otherwise would if you had waited for the tutorial. If you do start researching early, be careful that you don't burn through all your science points, as this can actually hurt you long term if you don't save enough science points to research required technologies in subsequent sectors. To offset this possibility, you should prioritize visiting points of interest that provide science, and also prioritize taking science points as a reward for away mission choices. Prioritizing science like this will give you a large buffer of research points and will help you to unlock more techs sooner. Building a second or a third science lab will also help in this regard. If you are restarting the campaign, then you can also use your foreknowledge of the upcoming sector's objectives and challenges to plan out what technologies you want to reach for early and which rooms you want to boost with your heroes. Well, that's all I've got for now. I would like to thank Gamer of an Unusual Size for his contributions to this list, and just for the discussions that I had with him in general about the game and its strategies. I hope that these tips help you to become the best Captain Janeway that you possibly can be. Well, at least in terms of managing logistics. When it comes to the moral and ethical decisions that the Delta Quadrant will be throwing at you, you're on your own.